So we've been looking at the server items for doing a SharePoint administration. One of the things that's really critical, though, is actually the content. When you're rolling out a SharePoint deployment, you need to make sure that not only is the back-end system going, the infrastructure is in good shape, but you actually need to know that the content that's coming into the site is going to be appropriate and what the users expect. For that, the first thing you need to do is identify the site owners. If you don't know who the site owners are, it's going to be very difficult to get approval and make sure that everything's going to meet their requirements for their business. The site owners are the ones who have the responsibility for the content on SharePoint. You as an administrator, your job is to make sure that the servers themselves are running, that everything's maintained, that everything's available. The owners themselves have the responsibility for the content. Unfortunately, there is an interface between those two, which are the templates, the workflows, and all of those that really kind of bridge that gap between what's going on with the functionality of SharePoint and what's actually stored inside SharePoint. Identifying the owners will additionally assist you in defining the structure of the site collections. This is where during your planning you kind of had everything rolled out. So you should already have a good idea of where those owners are. But when you're getting to this point, you are going to probably find that there's some things that weren't covered in your planning. Again, identify those owners, making sure that they know that they are responsible. Answers tend to change a little bit when you kind of go from who's going to own this or who's going to have it to you are responsible. When you find those changes and when you hear the, well, maybe that's not me, that should be someone else, make sure you take this, you have your planning and your testing for your sites at this level, but go back to your original planning documentation and make sure that's updated as well. You're going to have some changes when you get down to the site testing level, and you need to have those reflected back into your original planning. And be clear on assigning ownership. One of the other challenges you'll run into with testing the ownership of locations is that you'll have, well, I have this, I own this, but someone else owns another part of this. That's a clear flag that maybe you've got either organizationally you've got a challenge there, or you might not have put your structure in place correctly. Generally, there should be one owner. That person may delegate to others, but there should be someone who says, this is my area and this is what I should want done with it. You'll get bogged down in details and committees sometimes when you've got multiple pieces or you get too many kind of matrixed ownership. But then you'll also not have a clear purpose for each of the SharePoint site collections or sites. And nothing kind of makes your information management more difficult than to have multiple owners and not really know what's going on. You'll have a lot of difficulty with auditing as well, because if you don't know who should have access, then identifying when the wrong people have access or when they don't have enough access, then you're going to have challenges with that, just knowing that you've got a problem. So know that you need to look at that, have the ownership, have the people in place to say, yeah, this is your site. So now that we've identified who is there, we'll need to make sure we know what they need to do. You need to define and document the purpose for the SharePoint repository. And I'll use SharePoint repository here for either the SharePoint site collection or the SharePoint site. Sometimes it's even a web application. It actually goes up to that level that it may be a very large department that the owner is someone who owns a couple of site collections, depending on how you've put together your SharePoint information plan and how all of that's going to come together. Document what that purpose is, so therefore when you come back and there's maybe some confusion, or as the repository ages, you'll have that to look back on and identify when that needs to be changed or what's going on. If you don't know what it started out as, you can't know when you need to look at it and maybe make a break or do a refresh onto the location. Then, once you know the purpose, then you can define the types and structures of information to be stored and processed. We've done a lot of work with structures in the site collections, in the server farms, in all of those kind of things. Unfortunately, or fortunately, as your case may be, SharePoint continues down the list of being able to do structures. Each site collection can have, of course, multiple sites, as we mentioned in other sections, but also each of those sites can have a number of different types of information and how it stores it. At its root, SharePoint really only has one type of repository, and that's a list. But then as you start getting more detailed and more special case, you can actually see that a task list is very different from a document library, which is very different than maybe a calendar. All of these are basically underneath the covers lists. You're giving lots of detailed information on those different lists that you really want to know what's going on. And those are kind of things that your site owners are going to need to let you know what they need, how well it fits into the default types of structures, or how much they're going to need customized, and that will let you know how many new templates you may need to roll out. Define a theme for the site. On one sense, this ties back into that purpose, but on the other, because it has that purpose, you may have graphical items that need to be associated with the repository. This may be a custom style sheet. This may actually be different ways of viewing the information and structuring it. When we go over and take a look at our demo, we're going to see how we can actually change things around a little bit. But knowing what that theme is, maybe what the team colors are, what the organizational logo is, all of these things are tie into that theme for the site itself. And you need to know about it early on so you can actually make sure that you get those structures in place. And then define and document any workflows for the site information. This is one thing that often gets kind of pulled to the end, primarily because process people are generally used to working with their own tools. If you're doing an upgrade, you're probably going to have most of these already defined, especially if you've got a very active process group. Those people will already be familiar, and they're probably going to be beating on your door, making sure that you know about it. They should have. Process people are generally very, very good about doing documentation and having all that in place. But if you're doing a new implementation or something that where the users aren't really used to providing this information or aren't really used to having workflows in control, this is going to be something that you're probably going to have to do a little bit of pushing on. The idea, though, is that you want to make sure that the workflows are already associated with those information structures and types. Additionally, when you go through the workflows, you're actually going to shake the trees a little bit more and find anything that's not been identified. So each one of these pieces builds upon the previous one. So as you define the types and structures, and then when you get down to the workflows, then they'll go, and then I'll need a task list for, well, we didn't identify that back up there. Oh, now we need to go in and put that in place. So you're going to see that each one of these steps provides you additional information, and then you may need to go and update the previous steps. You also need them to provide you any existing templates for documents, such as Word, PowerPoint, Excel. This is one of those things that you're going to, again, if they're already in SharePoint, maybe they've worked with this, but often they haven't. This is one thing that as you mature with SharePoint that you need to make sure and keep an eye on. Very often you'll have a Word template or a PowerPoint template that gets created. Someone's very good at it inside your organization, and they'll create that first one, and then copies of it go around, and then copies of copies of copies. And after a while, this can actually be a problem inside your site structure. The reason why is because each one of these template types generally has some information in it, some metadata on those documents. And if you're getting additional copies moving around, what will happen is you'll get duplicate metadata across all of your organization. The next time you get a Word document from someone else, do a quick test, do a right click or do a settings and take a look at the metadata that's associated with that. Very often the author won't be the person who sent it to you or the person who even started the document if they weren't the original. Finding out what organizations are in there. There's a lot of metadata that could be in those templates that will actually actively mislead you for search results or for categorization or tags. So go in there, provide those templates, have them pull them out. You can also work with the document libraries to give you some additional information once those go in or providing new documents. But know that you probably do need to review those pretty carefully. Also, you're working with the owners. I've mentioned the process people and the rest of it. Have them identify their key personnel. This is where you can actually, once you've identified the owner pretty concretely, then you can take some of the load off of them by finding out who their designers are, who their power users are, who's the guy that's their big Excel maker, who's their PowerPoint guy who can actually make those great presentations. All of those kind of things of who are the people who are going to take ownership of parts of the site. The site owner has responsible for everything, but then you actually have individuals that can be delegated to for various aspects of the SharePoint site collection or site, the repository. So identify those, again, document them so you can come back in. Identify that when someone comes up asking for something outside of it, you can make sure that that the key personnel are either identified, or that you can identify that that person may have moved on to a different position, and be able to update your documentation. Find out that when people are in their right areas, or that you can refer them to those key personnel that should be aware of what they're doing and can help educate them as your first tier help desk. Once you've identified those, then you actually need to go in and create that single ownership for the site collection. When you've identified that, then if you have to actually put it into practice. Assign ownership of the sub-functionalities to the identified users in the organization. That's what we're having, that delegation. The owner, very, very often, as the responsible person, is not going to be the person who's actually going to run the site. So know that while you've got an owner in the organization, that it may be the process people who are going to be handling the workflows and customizations there. There may be a designer that works on the themes and the layout. There may be a number of people that are working on the different areas, that maybe tags on the document libraries, all of the tasks, monitoring progress and things like that. So once you get those top level people in place, then assign the ownership of the sub functionality to them, give them the right access, and make sure that everything's in place. And then provide a process for reviewing and reassigning ownership. As I mentioned, we know that organizations change, that people move around in roles. Have a way for you to be able to identify when that happens. Very often it's not inside the organizational process. Things tend to move fairly quickly, or users have other items to work on. So a lot of times that notification doesn't come back to you, especially if you're having the owners do a lot of their permission management. Pushing that information back up into the central administration often doesn't happen. So you need to make sure that you're able to connect with that you can actually do some of those touch bases, that you actually have your own process for kind of doing a confirmation ping into the organization to make sure, that they're not struggling with anything that you can help out with, that you still have the right people identified, and that they're in good shape, that nothing's actually going outside of the organizational standards as you work with your SharePoint deployment. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go and perform some of these actions. Actually go to one of our sites, make sure that we have the correct owner, and the collections are in the right ownership. So here we are at our site collection that we created earlier in the process. What we're going to do is we're going to go in and check for the site administrators and ensure that we have the right people in place, and then we're going to assign some additional information and some additional ownership on some of the content. So we'll go to Site Settings, and then we'll go to the Site Collection Administrators. And you can see here we have a group. This is the account that I'm currently logged into, which is the site administrator. We can actually add in additional people. We've got our John Doe, who will actually be the owner. It's always a good idea to keep yourself in as the site collection administrator if you are that farm administrator. You get access even if you're not an owner on it. But you do kind of want that in there to remind them that they do have both a backup, and there is some level above them that they can be aware of what's happening. So we'll go in, we'll add that. Again, we've got the single site administrator that's handling it. This may be where you have a delegate as well. So if John Doe is the person who actually owns the site and is responsible for it, we want to give them full access. But then we may want to put Joe Smith in, who is the delegated administrator and who will actually operate the site from day to day. We can very easily audit this and see what's going on here. If you've noticed in the previous section when we looked at different permissions, the site collection administrators have a little bit different role. This is basically the ability to make sure that they've got the permissions they need even outside of the other groups that they're in. And so now we've got the site collection administrators that are in place. What we're going to do is go over to Site Contents, and then we're going to go down to our Tasks list, which for this site we will say that there has been a person that's in charge of the tasks. They're the day-to-day project manager, and they're going to make sure that everything's in place and that any changes in the tasks are done correctly. So we're going to go to the list settings, and then we're going to change the permissions for this list to make sure that that person has the rights that they need. We're inheriting, as we saw earlier. We're going to stop inheriting. And then we're going to grant explicit permissions to our owner here, which will be the administrator, which we're going to have Joe be the project manager. We'll set it out, and we'll make sure that they have the full control. So they will own this, and they will be able to manage the list in the way that they're appropriate. Now, if your organization chooses to provide a lower level of control for the owners, that's one thing to be aware of, and then you can actually customize some of those permission levels. That being said, really, if they're not going to be given full control over the whichever sub-repository they should be managing, you may want to look and see if they're actually being delegated or if they're just a regular user, and at that point you could just give them in members or another role rather than breaking the permissions. So we'll come in here, we'll give them the permissions, and at that point they will be able to manage the rest of the permissions. You will actually turn it over to them rather than managing all the rest of the information yourself. This is where you're handing it off into the organization to actually do some of their self-management and their self-administration. So now that we have the owners and the repositories identified, we need to actually go through and do a review and test. Again, we've been doing reviews and tests from functionality standpoint, but this is making sure that your plans and all your items that you've identified move over into your SharePoint implementation. Once you do it, you actually need to make sure that information comes in correctly. You need to this is where you actually start bringing the day-to-day users, or at least those owners and managers, into the system so that you can see what the actual development processes look like, what the structure has been, actually getting them used to how the system works. Just as with your systems planning piece, prepare to go through this a couple of times. As detailed as you go on planning, as efficient as you are at identifying items, once users start working with the system and they start getting into it, you're always going to find things that go, oh, I can do that, or oh, we forgot to tell you, or those kind of things. Especially if they're coming from a non-SharePoint environment where the users may not be fully aware of all the items they could do. That being said, this is one of the great benefits of moving over into a SharePoint environment, of seeing what things can be automated, identifying to the users what things that they can actually do that frees up their day for doing other items, knowing what's in place and what they can handle. Even with an existing SharePoint user base, moving over to the new version, there are new capabilities. A lot of the social aspects are going to be new to them. Being able to actually tie in and see different pieces and work with users outside of the organization becomes fairly mind expanding for things they can do in there. So be prepared that you can come through, you can do the testing, you'll get suggestions, and it may loop through. You normally want to plan for probably about 3 times through the process. Any more, and you don't want to get in, you're in danger of running into analysis paralysis, where you're actually just cycling through again and again. Any less, and your users may not be as engaged as you want to, or they may not be actually reviewing. So figure 2 to 3 times is probably your optimal for going through the testing cycle. And make sure they bring you, they have example or existing data to test the workflows and the rest with. Because of the way that SharePoint workflows work, it's very easy to set it out on maybe a whiteboard or do some planning, but going through the actual process, actually passing items around through the interface, tends to bring out, again, new suggestions or maybe changes in the workflow. If you're already working with SharePoint in maybe 2007 or 2010 for the workflows, the interfaces are going to be not too dissimilar. There's going to be some things on the back end that you should have identified before this, but if users are not used to SharePoint and the workflow process, then you may need to do some additional education or may need to work with some additional steps as they see how other users are going to be able to access it. One example is having users outside of the site involved in the process, or having workflows that call additional workflows and need responses back in. These are situations where, from a academic point, they're not that big of a challenge, but in practical situations that you may need to put additional functionality in the system, may need additional rights, may even need structural changes to be able to isolate those pieces and move them around. So knowing this and knowing that when you're getting into testing, ideally, you're not going to have any big surprises with metadata. You're going to kind of know where those are. The structure is going to be in reasonable shape, but workflows are kind of that final piece, and they're also the piece that changes the most often inside most organizations. Generally not massively, but small changes and things like that. When you're automating those workflows, even small changes can make a difference, and you're going to need to make sure that the process people are both aware of all the capabilities inside of SharePoint and that they're ready to take over maintenance of that in their automated workflows. So now that we've actually talked about the pieces, let's go take a look at some of the things that we'll need to review and test inside of SharePoint. So when we're going through the SharePoint collections here, when you're working with your users and doing your testing, you want to make sure that they are aware of the look and feel for the collection, that they're aware of how everything comes into place and the structures. One of the things you need to let them know is to make sure that they understand all of the options that they have in the SharePoint site. For that, we're going to go into the site contents and make sure that you can educate them on where they can start with those default repositories and how they can be actually customized. If you're familiar with SharePoint, you'll notice that things have changed a little bit on the site contents. Whereas before you would be asked to add a list. Currently, all of the repositories have now been relabeled as apps. You'll hear a lot of things about applications in SharePoint. Just know that it's the way that the content has been packaged is how it's classified as an application. So we'll go in and take a look at the new capabilities. So as you see for your users, they will actually be suggested some noteworthy. You can actually modify this as an administrator, or it will actually catch up as your applications move around and details come into place. But you see that we have the ever-present document library, tasks library, and custom lists are set up for your users. You can actually see that those come down into the apps you can add as well. There has been some additional work on things like the picture library, discussion boards, and additional content. And then we can actually move over. We've added the access services for this site collection. So we actually have access apps. And you can see that as you create different functionality inside of SharePoint, it'll be surfaced here for your users. So we'll actually step back to the first page and take a look. As your users are putting together their information, one of the things that you do want to look at is gathering information and storing information. Document libraries and form libraries are going to be one of your most important pieces. Be aware that as you're working with them, users will tend to put their documents in a single document library. You want to make sure that they understand some of those capabilities. If they're used to working with file shares, make sure that they're looking at document libraries as folders instead of file shares. This makes it much easier for them and you to manage for a security point, and also for things to be broken out in a logical manner. forms libraries for gathering information. If you have any requests for custom applications to gather information, take a look at a forms library, especially with the form services, so that, again, those users can actually do some of their self-service management, and actually, instead of creating a new application, they can actually gather that information into a form library and then use that as it moves around through your system. We've got wiki libraries, we've got pictures, we can actually put in metadata, contacts, calendars are very common, discussion boards, and there's a number of pieces here. So take a look through all of these pieces. You can always see the details on each one of them and have your users go through and make sure that they've read what the details are on each of their options. This will help you out in the long run, because users being able to reconfigure items that are already in the system prevents you from having to do a lot of customization or new creations inside. So let's go back to the collection. And let's look at items that are already there so you can make sure that they understand how their information is going to fit into this as they test. While we look at our tasks, we can see that there's a lot of, there's some standard pieces here. We have a task already in, it's already been assigned, but generally the users are going to want to do some updates on this. There are a couple of things that can be done with that. You can actually go in and work with how the items are displayed, alerts, but then the list itself, you can actually gather and create different views upon the list or the items. So you can actually do modifications, change columns, change the way things are viewed. If you do need to do customization, at the view level is the best place to put your resources in to be able to have the users get some of their custom functionality with that. You can actually have them create additional columns on the list. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. You can actually create additional information that's going to be stored on these tasks. If they need maybe let's put a column name of we'll say that we have just a column name of department. What we're going to do is actually do a choice, and then we'll see that in just a second. We'll require that it contains information, and we won't require unique values. You can see that now our page is updated. It's refreshed us, so we want to go there. We want to say we'll display it as a drop-down menu because that's what people normally like. And we will have a default choice of production floor. We're not going to allow fill-in choices. We don't let people create their own departments. And now when users put in their tasks, you can see we have an additional column of information we're gathering on. So this is the way that you need to go in and test that all of the information that the users are pulling into the system is represented. And one of the pieces of the ways that you can actually mitigate some of those risks when you get surprises by having the users do this configuration themselves and put it into the system. You can actually see that you can customize the forms for InfoPath to gather this information in a more rich manner. And then we'll go to the list settings as well to see any additional items that you can have them handle as self-service. We've got the name, description, and navigation, which should be fairly simple. You can see the address and an additional description if you choose to do that. Changing the name to something a little bit more specific is probably going to be what you want to do with, at least for default templates. You may want to customize this in your templates. We'll cover that in a later section. You can do audience targeting if you've got people like the tasks, maybe specifically for project managers. They can actually set that up and put it into place. You can actually, once you get it into place, especially if users are doing additional work on this or additional customizations, you can work with templates. Again, we're going to look at that in a subsequent section, and you can be aware of those kind of pieces. Your workflow settings are going to be where you associate it with that, and generally go through and make sure that what they're getting is what they need. So you've got that. You can actually go through all of this and make sure that you understand what's going on, generally by using user training or actually being aware of all of the items that are inside the list themselves, and then work with your users to educate them and let them be able to work with this data in a very controlled manner for themselves. So one of the items that's key for the negotiation between content owners and SharePoint administrators is item versioning. Item versioning is a great feature in SharePoint, but also is something that can really be a major item for worrying about storage in SharePoint. Item versioning came out of publishing in SharePoint. It basically provides a major and minor release and stores copies of each of those for publishing out an improved version and maybe minor in-work versions. It's very, very useful for collaboration, but it's also very useful for seeing the history or the evolution of assets inside of SharePoint. You can actually see that maybe a project plan has been put up as a document and has gone through several minor revisions as teams worked on it, and then major revisions as those teams passed it around and actually worked together. So knowing all of that, it's a very key piece of functionality for the business users, for the end users. But for SharePoint administrators, there's a catch. Each version of the asset is a full copy. Allow that to flow into your storage planning. If you're mainly working with, say, PowerPoint files or Excel file spreadsheets or Word documents, these days storage is large enough that you don't have to worry about that as much. The piece to look at for an administration is identify assets that may be larger than what you're used to. If you're having users that are working with very large graphics files, maybe you have a design department that's using SharePoint as the repository for all of their photos, and they may be touching things up or making different views of it. Know that each copy creates another full storage requirement for that document. So if you allow users to have 5 or 6 versions back, then you're looking at basically 6 or 7 times the storage requirements just for that one asset. If you're putting very large files in, say an Access database or video files or those kind of things that are being controlled through SharePoint, then you need to be very aware of what's going on, because your storage requirements can blow up very quickly. Or if you got users that do need to have very long histories inside of their versioning, you need to be aware of that and bring that into your storage management plan. Following on to that is your recycle bin. SharePoint is different than many other web repositories in that it does have a recycle bin. As a matter of fact, it has 2 recycle bins. There's one for the end users and one for the site collection owners. This basically provides a 2-stage delete process, which means that even if you have users who show a little bit of a tendency to keep their recycle bin clean or haven't been watching things very carefully, when they come back and speak with administration and go, my file is gone, this helps prevent you from having to go to your backup tapes and restore content databases to pull content out, which is a very painful process for just a file or two, especially if it can be prevented. It was when the recycle bin actually appeared in SharePoint, it was a very good day for administrators. The recycle bin for the users is scoped to their locale. So if they're in a sub-site or if they're in a different location, they're actually going to see it there. If you have a user that has multiple sub-sites and they're looking for content, make sure they're looking in the right place. You can actually see what's going on in there. That being said, the recycle bin for the site collection is scoped to the top level. So if you're coming in or your site collection administrator is coming in, they're going to come up to the top site collection and they're going to be able to see the deleted items all across the collection. So that's a good way to go in and find things and be able to help users restore information that they may have trouble finding themselves. It becomes a fairly interesting process when users aren't really sure where it was or where they deleted it from, or misremember maybe where that information was stored. As soon as information comes out of their review cycle, the memory of where it was becomes a little bit different from what they've experienced. Note that when you delete sites, they are also dropped into the recycle bin. So if you have someone who accidentally deletes a subsite, maybe a document workflow site or some type of piece there. It's dropped into that recycle bin, so you're in good shape there. You can actually go back and do some restoration. But once, and this is where knowing the difference between the site collections and the sites, once a site collection is deleted, it's deleted, and you are going to need to look at those backups. The reason for this is kind of structural. If a site collection is deleted, there's no site collection recycle bin for it to go into. That is removed as well. So be very aware of that. And while your normal users aren't going to get access to that site collection deletion, those administrators and those top level people are going to need to be very aware of those differences between deleting a site and a site collection. So be aware of that and know what you need to do and query them to make sure they understand that, because getting comfortable with deleting sites means that you're also in a little bit of risk of those users who have access possibly not paying attention to deleting the collection. At that point, you're kind of back to your backup tapes. And then the recycle settings themselves are managed at the web application level. This is good because now you can actually go in and you can change it around. You can make sure that they have enough space, but it also means that you don't have a site collection owner going in and saying, I want my recycle bin to store 500% of my general storage, and blowing out your storage plan as well. So going in there, making sure that the site collection owners know what the recycle bin is, how long back it is, how much space is going to be allocated to it, and you can actually work with them and negotiate with them on how much storage they need. Many site collection owners like to run a clean ship. They may not want a lot of things in the storage in the recycle bin, so they know what's going on. Others are pack rats and maybe want lots of information. Work with them, negotiate with them, and see what they need and actually what fits into your storage budget so that you can actually provide the best value to them. So having talked about that, let's go in and take a look at the versioning and recycle bin on your site collection. So here we are on our site collection. Let's drop back into our document library and look at the versioning that we have and do the settings. So we've got our documents in here. You can actually see that we've got our information, and we don't have the versioning set on. So let's go into the library itself and look at the library settings and our versioning. At this point, we've got no versioning on. We don't have content approval. We're going to have this as a workflow, so we're going to leave the approval off. That's mainly for publishing, but we're actually going to allow major and minor draft versions inside the document. This is where we can actually manage with the users and work on the major and minor versions. So what we're going to do here is we're going to provide 4 versions of the major and then 4 drafts or minor versions as we go through it. And then we're going to allow only the users who can edit to see the draft items, because if they're can't edit, then they really don't have a need for that. And then we're not going to require the document to be checked out. This is one of those pieces that your process people are going to work on. We're just working on the storage side of things. So we go through. Let's let it save. And then we can go back to our, and now we've actually set it up so that we can actually do multiple copies of our document, multiple versions. We'll go through and confirm that this has been done. We're doing testing, so we need to make sure that we've got that. So to test the versionings, what we're going to do is we're going to check out the document. And then we're going to check it back in. We actually don't need to do a new version. We just need to tell it that we've done it. And we'll put in we're not going to do a checkout. We're going to do a 1.1 to be able to see. And then we're doing a and so now to ensure that we've configured it correctly, go in and take a look at our version history. And you can see we've versioned it correctly. We've actually got the 1.0, 1.1. We can actually make sure that the administrators can delete versions or clear things up. We'll make sure that they can get the information they need. Additionally, we're going to look very quickly at the recycle bin. So the first thing I'm going to do with that is make sure that we have something for the recycle bin. So for the users to get to the recycle bin, it's moved, if you're an experienced SharePoint person, to under Site Contents. And we can see that we have 3 things in the recycle bin. So we can go in and take a look. And at this point, we can see that we've deleted our item. Let's restore it back. And voila, we've undone that delete. Now let's actually go into the second tier, which is under Site Settings. And now we can take a look at what the administrator sees. It's right under the Site Collection Administration. And you can see that not only do we see what's in the recycle bin itself, but we can see the end user recycle bin, which right now looks at the same piece, and then deleted from the end user recycle bin, which helps us find items that maybe end users no longer can see, but that we can. Go ahead and take a look. And we can see that one item's been deleted from the end user recycle bin that they can't put in, that we can drop in. So we actually manage the recycle bins over on Central Administration. And we go into Manage Web Applications, and on our site, it is under our General Settings. And our recycle bin we have on, we can turn it off if we choose to. We have a number of days that items can stay in, and in the second stage recycle bin, we can give a percentage of the quota for the recycle. Now that being said, is as the site itself takes up the live quota, it will delete things in the second stage recycle bin first. So there, you want to make sure the administrators keep an eye on that, and so they keep the recycle bin second stage at least in good shape.